My definition of music design, put simply, is the act of scoring music to a dynamic media experience, and everything that entails. Throughout this talk, I'll break down that definition into its pragmatic nuts and bolts. Music design and implementation is a topic I've spoken and written about a few times recently from various angles. And recalling further, I realized I touched on it in the late 90s in a talk called Design with Music in Mind, aimed at game designers. So to make this topic relevant to this moment in time, the emphasis is on how music design and implementation function best as an integral part of the larger music composition and production team. Today we're not going to look at the future of adaptive music. I'm interested in what can be done right now with the tools at our very fingertips, with the techniques that are already written about in textbooks, but adopted more widely with greater nuance and detail, hopefully becoming commonplace and an expected part of any game's development. From there, the focus is on the very idea of music design, i.e., recognizing it, bringing the work that's being done to the surface, because there's a lot of excellent music design being done. It's just not generally credited as such. It's nobody's title at this point, but it gets done nonetheless. Sometimes the audio director does it. It can be the composer, the technical sound designer, a game designer, and music seems to make its way nicely into games somehow. But this work can be done more consistently with greater attention to detail when the roles of music design and implementation are given their due. A bit of historical context before we dive into the current state of music design. Adaptive music is music that changes based on dynamic gameplay and user input. As simple as crossfading an ambient track to a combat track on one end of the spectrum, all the way to using instrument layers, short phrases, stingers, and smooth transitions on the other end. It's what allows music to follow the emotional arc and intent of gameplay, which is inherently dynamic and interactive. In very broad brushstrokes, let's break down the evolution of adaptive scoring into three general eras. First, the 80s and 90s. Chip music and MIDI-based music was fairly dynamic and adaptive. The techniques at hand were malleable, and composers were commonly working alongside the dev teams, often programming the music into games themselves. This made for a tight bond between game design and music design. Then, by the mid-1990s, pre-recorded music was possible in games, a huge breakthrough. So from that point through the early 2000s, music began to feature live orchestra, singers, instrumentalists, stylistically moving towards a film aesthetic, with an emphasis on sonic fidelity. And that certainly has been a welcome advancement. Yet we lost something along the way during this era. We lost that close connection between game design and game music. In many cases, music was just a long playlist of songs that played nonstop, regardless of what the player was doing. Thankfully, new game audio tools came along, making it easier to work with pre-recorded music tracks within a game. And things have improved greatly since then, but old habits die hard. Finally, between 2010 and 2020, there's been really excellent yet inconsistent progress towards merging high-fidelity music and live performance along with more sophisticated music designs. And by sophisticated, I don't necessarily mean complex music designs, not tricky per se, but straightforward, tasteful, well-executed music placement and integration. And yet, in 2020, this still isn't the norm across the board. So let's dig into what music design is in greater detail and get at why it's so important. In addition to the concise definition we started with, i.e., the act of scoring music to a dynamic media experience, let's add the creative act of deciding where, when, and how music will play in a game in order to support gameplay, game design, and the emotional changes throughout the experience. In other words, a spotting session for games. But unlike traditional spotting sessions for film or television, games don't have a fixed timeline. They're dynamic by nature, adding a layer of challenge to the task. There are two inseparable aspects of music design, two sides of the same coin, really. The creative, which is analogous to a film's spotting session, just mentioned, and the technical, the authoring and arranging of music files into the game audio engine, and the plumbing and setup needed within the game editor tools and engine, all with the aim of bringing the creative music design to fruition. One of my credos is that the creative leads the technical, so that the brainstorming isn't constrained to preconceived notions of what the given tech is capable of. At the same time, the tools and tech at hand will greatly inform the creative process, often inspiring innovative ideas due to those very constraints. So what's next? What's the next best step for the game music community in 2020? I've spent the better part of my career pushing on the boundaries of what's possible in a dynamic game score, pushing tools to their limits and having programmers write new features for me to achieve those creative ends. But for now, rather than push on the edges further, I'd like to promote and see a much broader swath of game music professionals embracing the tools and techniques that are right in front of us, taking proven concepts and applying them tastefully to a variety of game design scenarios. Let's raise the median, the average, the baseline for music design and implementation in games. There's plenty of room for nuance and creative application within existing tool sets. Let's thoroughly explore what it is to do this work well and consistently, developing a common language of music design along the way. Because we can't reach much higher individually until the foundation is built up further as a community. With a wider base of audio and music professionals gaining experience and expertise in these areas, a momentum will be built, leading to better tools and more efficient methods of implementation. This is why a critical mass of professionals serious about this work is needed in order to create a positive feedback loop towards the betterment of the craft, ultimately leading to a greater percentage of games where the scoring of the music matches the fidelity of the recordings. So how do we accomplish this modest goal for our community? Well, it's up to us. It's up to all of us collectively, audio directors, composers, but also game directors and designers, to insist on a few things. First, prioritize music design and implementation for your game in line with how other aspects of music production are prioritized, and budget time and money for it accordingly. The in-game music score is only as strong as its weakest link, which often ends up being design and integration. Second, outline these roles early and clearly and assign responsibilities to specific individuals. Music design tends to end up with a leaderless committee and implementation given to someone junior on the audio dev team. But in order to be done well, that work needs to be led by people with a depth of experience, musicianship, and even compositional background. Third, credit the roles of music designer and music implementer. If a different title is preferred for this work, that's fine, as long as the work is recognized. But this will help establish and legitimize this work across our community, while raising awareness of it as a worthy investment for development teams. Fourth, include music design from the very start of game development through to the very end. The music design can inform the compositional process throughout production and will determine specific deliverables needed for implementation. And this, in turn, affects how cues will need to be recorded, if the score includes live instrumentation. So who takes on the role of music designer typically? There's no single or correct answer to this, and it will vary based on game, dev team, and the audio team at hand. Here are a few options for the role, including pluses and minuses to each. Let's start with the obvious choice, the composer. This makes sense as music design is the act of scoring for games. The composer can plot out creative design and compositional themes in parallel, making it easier to conceptualize what's needed and what's possible. Some game composers do their own music design work even if they don't do the implementation themselves. They know the games they work on intimately, play them thoroughly, and understand the aims of the game's design. And this strong connection shows in the results of those games. Many composers, however, aren't involved in the music design at all, collaborating on the aesthetics of the score, but fulfilling a prescribed set of cues given to them by the client. And this can work just fine with the right music and audio team in place. Particularly on larger projects, there are a lot of roles and responsibilities on the music production team that the composer hires out, including orchestration, mixing, conducting, etc. So there's room for specialists within music design as well. Sometimes the audio director fills the role as music designer. A huge advantage here is that the audio director is already embedded with the development team and has working relationships established. They're in a great place to coordinate between composers and the dev team. The downside is that the audio director already has so many responsibilities, wearing a ton of hats, and adding the music design hat can lead to the music design not getting the time and attention it may need. One way around this would be to delegate music design to an audio lead or sound designer on the team who has a music background. Or for the audio director to delegate other tasks like VO or casting to someone else in order to wear the music design hat themselves. But what about the music implementer? Music design and music implementation can be done very well by the same person, the obvious advantage being that a creative idea can be tested and verified very quickly in the audio and game engine. This tight loop between concept and realization is a powerful advantage throughout the process. However, music implementation itself is often folded into the general task of audio integration and done by a technical sound designer. This can work okay depending on the needs of the music design, but it also runs the risk of getting short shrift when there are thousands of sound effects to hook up as well. To prevent this, many larger scale games have a dedicated music implementer. And what about the crazy idea of a dedicated music designer? Sounds decadent, but a contract music designer doesn't need to be on the team full-time for the full duration of the project. They can be brought on at the start and then periodically throughout the music production process as needed. The trick for this type of setup is getting a working relationship going in a way that facilitates easy communication and access to design documents, builds, and game tools. More on this working remotely in a bit. So far, I've been talking about the creative side of music design. But in order to bring a design to fruition, we must dive into the technical underbelly of music systems design. And there are two main areas where this work takes place: the audio engine plus its authoring tool, and the game engine with its editor. And most importantly, how the two will be interconnected to communicate with each other. In the game audio editor, decisions about how the music will be authored are made, i.e., will there be vertical layers, horizontal segments, how will they transition, etc. And third-party tools such as Wise, Fmod, and Elias, plus Unity and Unreal's audio capabilities, have made this aspect of the work accessible and fairly common for audio professionals. There are legions of budding audio designers gaining experience with these tools. But the devil is in the detail. And without following the music design through to the game engine, you'll end up with a half-built bridge to nowhere. Setting up music files within segments and layers is the easy part. The challenge and the key to success are making the right connections between the game engine and the audio engine. In order to design a solid music system, some knowledge about how games are built, how they're designed, and what drives them is needed. One place to start is learning the basics of a third-party game engine like Unreal or Unity. And that conceptual knowledge can be transferable to other engines, proprietary or otherwise. The most common game elements that drive music systems are game states, triggers, timelines, and real-time data. And when starting to design a music system, the very first question I ask the development team is, what are the states and data that have already been created for the game? Using these existing hooks is more efficient and saves programmer time. Other states or functionality can be added programmatically if needed, but use what's already available first. Often, those game hooks need to be exposed within the game editing tool for the music implementer to work with. This can be done by creating a simple UI or script in the editor, or simply by having those hooks and data sent directly to the audio engine. But before I get too far into the weeds here, since a whole talk could be dedicated to systems design, the overarching point is this. Contemporary audio tools and game authoring tools have made it possible to design and integrate music systems with far less programmer time, saving that valuable programmer time for the deeper, low-level tasks, while having the audio team be responsible for higher-level design, integration, and even scripting in the game engine. And this increases the odds of a successful score. So have your music team take more ownership of the systems that drive the music, and you'll be able to iterate faster while having greater control and creative nuance. After a system is designed and integrated, implementation of music assets can be done. Now, it's never as neat and tidy as that. Systems design and implementation often overlap and intermingle, to be sure. But once the system is established, more and more music can be added in a more systematic, templatized way. Like systems design, there are two distinct aspects of music implementation: the authoring of the music assets within the audio engine, and integrating the triggers and calls into the game editor. I've been on projects where I was responsible specifically for the asset authoring side of things, while a member of the dev team took care of the game editor side. And I've also worked on many games where I've been responsible for both. And I'll say this: game music authoring is a far more predictable task than the game editor work, which can vastly be different from game to game. And a big part of the challenge is learning the way any specific game is set up and how things are organized. It's a bit like being an electrician going into an unfamiliar house. The first step is sussing out where all the wires are. This may be part of the reason it's harder to find music implementation candidates who have experience in both. So the same advice applies here for anyone interested in expanding their music design and implementation horizons. Get to know the game editing tools, even for the ability to better communicate with development teams, if not for the skills themselves. I also want to briefly bring up scripting. Game editing tools use scripting languages like C# and Unity or Unreal's visual blueprints, but even if you don't know scripting, audio implementers will often need to fill in the blank in a script with the right music call or attach a music node to a visual script. So having someone on the music team with real scripting chops is a huge plus, especially for systems design. There's one more role I'd like to bring up that's related to implementation and music design, and for a lack of a better term, I call this adaptive music arranging. There are projects for which, instead of receiving ready-made music cues and assets from a composer for a specific design, the implementer is given sets of long general music cues in the form of stem mixes. And from these instrument stems, game-ready music assets must be fashioned. These are situations where having composition and arranging chops is absolutely necessary. These new game cues can be arranged in a linear DAW such as Reaper or Pro Tools, as well as within a game audio authoring tool for flexible adaptive behavior. Some of these new arrangements will sound virtually identical to the original cues, while many become wholly new cues, but with the familiar thematic content. Intros, endings, and transitions are edited from this material, and at times the arranger will add their own supporting instrument tracks. This work truly is music arranging, but with the aim of creating the specific elements needed for the game score. Here's a snapshot view of the roles and responsibilities covered in this talk and how they interrelate. If you're an audio director or music director, making sure these roles are adequately covered and planned for is important. Most freelance composers offer composition along with production of music cues and assets, but not music design or implementation. And I'm curious as to why not. Anecdotally, I've seen several game development studios looking to fill some combination of these roles, which brings us to the topic of career. Currently, most music integration and systems design is done in-house, but that's starting to change. Even prior to this year, more and more development studios have been willing to allow off-site work directly in their game editor using source control software for remote check-ins. Most all of my clients over the past 2.5 years or so have given me just that type of access. And now, in 2020, all bets are off and remote work is ubiquitous. Now there's a good deal of outsourced work that requires the ability to work remotely with game tools and source control. But when most of the dev team is remote as well, it actually makes it easier for freelance teams to plug into not only their tech, but also their communications, documentation, and information sharing systems. Music professionals tend to have a wide range of competency, plus a few specific areas of expertise, such as a composer who can cover a wide range of styles, but is particularly good at choral arranging. The skills I've described here are currently underserved and underrepresented in game development. And that may sound like a detriment, but I see it as an opportunity for young as well as seasoned audio professionals. There are hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of composers looking for work in games and media. But a small fraction of them have music design and implementation skills. So look for collaborators to fill the specialties you don't currently serve, the way you might look for a mixing or mastering engineer. Conversely, if you have a specialty like music implementation, look for composers to collaborate with. You may get more work as a team than individually. Assembling a game music team that includes music design and implementation specialists will translate to greater creative possibilities and better quality control of the music all the way to the finish line. And as this holistic approach to game music production becomes more common, or even the norm, game music scores will certainly benefit, and that means games will benefit, which in turn will allow us all to reach higher. Thank you.